Part 1. A mother's worry. The steam from the shower curled out of the bathroom like a ghostly veil, and Melissa Thompson watched as her 16-year-old daughter, Ellie, stepped into the hallway. Her cheeks flushed an unusual shade of red. It wasn't the typical glow of warmth after a hot shower. This was something deeper, almost unnatural. Melissa frowned. "Ellie, are you okay? Your face looks really red." Ellie brushed it off with a laugh, her damp hair sticking to her neck. "Mom, it's just the hot water. No big deal." But Melissa couldn't shake the gnawing sense of unease. Over the past few weeks, she had noticed the same reaction every time Ellie showered. At first, she thought it was a reaction to soap or shampoo, but switching brands didn't help. The redness seemed to linger longer each time. That morning, as Melissa folded laundry in the living room, Ellie's voice called out, "Mom, it's happening again." Melissa rushed to the bathroom to find Ellie sitting on the edge of the tub, her face beet red, beads of sweat forming along her hairline. This time, the redness extended down her neck and onto her chest. "We're going to the doctor," Melissa said firmly. The unexpected diagnosis. The clinic was crowded, and Melissa fidgeted nervously in her chair while Ellie stared at her phone, seemingly unfazed. When the nurse finally called them back, they were ushered into an exam room where a tall, middle-aged man in a crisp white coat introduced himself as Dr. Lewis. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked, his tone professional but warm. Melissa explained the situation while Ellie sat on the exam table, looking slightly embarrassed. Dr. Lewis nodded thoughtfully. "Let's take a look," he said, donning a pair of gloves. He examined Ellie's face, neck, and chest with meticulous care, his brow furrowing slightly. He asked a series of questions about her diet, skincare routine, and any recent changes in lifestyle. After a few minutes, he leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "It appears to be a form of skin hypersensitivity, possibly linked to an environmental trigger," he said. "But I'll need to run some tests to confirm." Melissa's stomach tightened. "Is it serious?" Dr. Lewis offered a small, reassuring smile. "Not necessarily, but it's important to identify the cause to prevent it from worsening." A growing unease over the next few days, Ellie underwent blood tests, patch tests, and even an allergy screening. Dr. Lewis kept in close contact, providing regular updates. Melissa appreciated his attentiveness, though she couldn't help but feel a strange undercurrent of discomfort during their conversations. It was little things, his gaze lingering just a moment too long, the overly familiar tone he used when speaking to Ellie. At first, Melissa brushed it off as her imagination, but the feeling persisted. Then came the incident at the clinic. Melissa had stepped out to take a phone call while Ellie was in with Dr. Lewis for a follow-up. When she returned, the door was slightly ajar, and she overheard snippets of their conversation. "You're very brave," Dr. Lewis was saying. "Most patients your age wouldn't handle this so well." Ellie's voice was barely audible. "Thanks, I guess." Melissa knocked and entered, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. Dr. Lewis stood quickly, his expression unreadable. A late-night revelation that night. As Melissa reviewed the paperwork Dr. Lewis had given her, she noticed something strange. His signature on the forms was different from the one on Ellie's initial intake documents. Frowning, she pulled out her laptop and began researching the clinic. Everything seemed legitimate at first, but when she searched for Dr. Lewis's medical license number, she couldn't find it in the state database. Her heart began to race. Could it be a mistake? Or was there something more sinister at play? Melissa decided to call the clinic the next morning to verify his credentials. But before she could, an unsettling event derailed her plans. A mysterious visit. The doorbell rang just after 9 p.m. Melissa, who had been going over Ellie's test results, wasn't expecting anyone. She opened the door to find a man in a suit standing on the porch, his expression grim. "Mrs. Thompson?" he asked. "Yes." He reached into his jacket and produced a badge. "Detective Harris. I need to speak with you about Dr. Lewis." Melissa's blood ran cold. "What about him?" The detective hesitated before answering. We have reason to believe he's not who he claims to be. Melissa stepped aside, her heart pounding, as Detective Harris entered the living room. He moved with the measured authority of someone accustomed to delivering bad news, and Melissa's stomach churned as he glanced around the room, taking everything in. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice trembling. Harris pulled out a notepad and flipped it open. "We're currently investigating a man posing as Dr. Eric Lewis. He's been operating under false credentials at multiple clinics in the area." Melissa's knees threatened to buckle. "You're saying he's not a real doctor?" Harris nodded grimly. "It appears so. We have evidence that he's been accessing medical facilities under fraudulent pretenses. His motives are unclear, but we believe he may be targeting vulnerable patients." Melissa's blood ran cold. "My daughter. She's been seeing him for weeks. He's run tests, given advice. Are you saying none of it is real?" "That's what we're trying to determine," Harris said. "But we need your cooperation. Anything you can tell us about your interactions with him could be crucial." Uncovering the truth, Melissa recounted everything: how Dr. Lewis had first examined Ellie, the numerous tests he'd ordered, and his increasingly frequent follow-up calls. Harris listened intently, jotting down notes. "Did he ever prescribe medication?" he asked. Melissa shook her head. "No, but he mentioned it might be necessary. He wanted to run more tests first." Harris frowned. "That's consistent with what we've heard from other families. He builds trust before escalating." "Escalating to what?" Melissa demanded, fear lacing her voice. Harris hesitated. "In some cases, it's financial fraud, billing for unnecessary procedures. In others, we suspect more personal motives." The room seemed to spin. "He's been alone with my daughter," Melissa whispered. Confronting Ellie, Melissa rushed upstairs, finding Ellie sitting on her bed with headphones on, scrolling through her phone. The sight of her calm, oblivious demeanor struck a sharp contrast to the storm brewing in Melissa's mind. "Ellie," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Ellie looked up, startled by her mother's tone. "What's wrong? Have you ever felt uncomfortable around Dr. Lewis? Did he ever say or do anything that seemed off?" Ellie frowned, setting her phone down. "Not really. I mean, he's a little weird sometimes, like overly nice, but nothing bad." Melissa pressed further. "Are you sure? It's really important." Ellie's brow furrowed. "Mom, what's going on?" Melissa took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "Dr. Lewis isn't who he says he is. The police think he might be dangerous." Ellie's eyes widened, her face going pale. "What? But he seems so normal." "That's what makes him dangerous," Melissa said, her voice firm. "We're going to figure this out, Ellie. I promise." The missing files determined to protect her daughter and uncover the truth. Melissa went back to the paperwork Dr. Lewis had given her. She combed through every detail, but nothing seemed out of place, at least not at first. It wasn't until she compared Ellie's test results with the clinic's online portal that she noticed discrepancies. Several tests listed as completed in Dr. Lewis's documents didn't appear in the clinic system. Melissa called the clinic immediately. "I need to speak with someone about my daughter's medical records," she told the receptionist. After a brief hold, the receptionist returned. "I'm sorry, but there's no record of those tests being ordered or completed. Are you sure they were done here?" Melissa's heart sank. "Positive. Dr. Lewis," the receptionist interrupted. "Dr. Lewis? I'm sorry, ma'am, but we don't have anyone by that name on staff." A chilling discovery. Melissa ended the call, her hands shaking. Everything Dr. Lewis had done, the tests, the follow-ups, even his presence at the clinic, had been an elaborate fabrication. She called Detective Harris immediately, relaying what she had learned. "He's covering his tracks," Harris said. "If there's no record of the tests, it's likely he either falsified them or never conducted them at all. We need to move fast before he disappears." "Can you protect my daughter?" Melissa asked, her voice breaking. Harris's tone softened. "We'll do everything we can." A warning call later that evening. As Melissa paced the living room, her phone buzzed. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, but something compelled her to answer. "Mrs. Thompson," a voice said, smooth and familiar. Melissa's blood froze. "Dr. Lewis?" There was a pause and then a low chuckle. "I hear you've been asking questions. That's not a good idea." Her grip on the phone tightened. "What do you want?" "To remind you that some things are better left alone," he said, his tone chillingly calm. "Ellie is special. It would be a shame if anything happened to her." Melissa's chest tightened with fear and fury. "Stay away from my daughter," she shouted. But the line had already gone dead. The race against time. Melissa immediately called Detective Harris, recounting the call in a panicked rush. "He threatened her," she said, her voice shaking. "You have to find him before he does something." "We're already tracking him," Harris assured her. "But I need you to stay vigilant. Don't let Ellie out of your sight." Melissa hung up, her resolve hardening. Whatever it took, she would protect her daughter. As she locked every door and window in the house, a single thought consumed her. Dr. Lewis wasn't just a liar. He was a predator, and he wasn't finished yet. Part 3. The predator revealed. Melissa barely slept that night, her mind a whirlwind of fear and anger. She spent hours sitting by Ellie's bedroom door, her ear pressed against it, listening for the slightest sound. Detective Harris had promised to keep her updated, but every hour that passed without news felt like a lifetime. By morning, Melissa's phone buzzed with a text from Harris. "We've traced him to a property outside the city. Moving in today. We'll update." Relief and dread mixed in her chest. If they caught Dr. Lewis, this nightmare could finally end. But the thought of what he might have planned, or already done, left her paralyzed. An empty house later that afternoon, Harris called. "We raided the property," he said. It was a house he rented under a fake name. "And?" Melissa asked, gripping the phone. "No sign of him, but we found something you need to see." The evidence. Detective Harris met Melissa at the station, where he handed her a file. Inside were photographs of the house's interior, cluttered rooms filled with medical equipment, test tubes, and stacks of documents. "He was running some kind of operation," Harris explained. "We're still analyzing everything, but it looks like he was conducting his own tests on patients." Melissa flipped through the photos, her stomach turning at the sight of what appeared to be a child's school photo pinned to a bulletin board. "Is that Ellie?" she asked, her voice trembling. Harris nodded. "We found dozens of photos of her, taken without her knowledge. At school, in your yard, even through the window of your home." Melissa's legs buckled, and she gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. "How long has he been watching us?" "From what we can tell, at least 6 months. Maybe longer." The missing files among the evidence. Investigators discovered a series of encrypted files on a laptop. Harris explained that they appeared to contain detailed notes on various patients, including Ellie. "Most of the files were corrupted," he said, "but we recovered fragments. He wasn't just pretending to be a doctor. He was experimenting." Melissa's skin crawled. "Experimenting on what?" Harris hesitated. "We don't know yet, but whatever it was, Ellie was a key part of it. There's something unique about her that he was fixated on." A dangerous game. The police increased their patrols around Melissa's home, and she was advised to keep Ellie out of school for the time being. Melissa tried to keep things as normal as possible for Ellie, but the tension was impossible to hide. One evening, as Melissa made dinner, Ellie wandered into the kitchen. "Mom," she said quietly, "why does everyone keep asking me questions about Dr. Lewis?" Melissa froze. "Who's been asking you questions?" "Just people at school. They said the police came by and asked about him." "Is he in trouble?" Melissa forced a smile, masking her panic. "He might have done something wrong, sweetie, but you're safe. That's all that matters." Ellie looked unconvinced but didn't press further. The nightmarish returned 3 days later. The nightmare escalated. Melissa returned from running errands to find the front door ajar. Panic surged through her as she called out, "Ellie!" There was no response. Grabbing a kitchen knife, she moved through the house, her heart pounding. In the living room, She found an envelope sitting on the coffee table with her name scrawled on it. Inside was a photograph of Ellie asleep in her bed, taken that same night. The note beneath it read, "I'm not finished with her." Breaking point. Melissa called the police, her hands trembling so badly she could barely dial. Within minutes, Harris and his team arrived, combing through the house for evidence. "He's taunting us," Harris said, his expression grim. "This is his way of reminding you that he's still in control." "I can't live like this," Melissa said, tears streaming down her face. "He's inside my house watching my daughter. What if he takes her?" "We won't let that happen," Harris promised. "We're increasing surveillance. He won't get close." A risky plan, but Melissa couldn't wait for the police to act. That night, as Ellie slept safely in a secure location arranged by the police, Melissa sat alone in her living room, a plan forming in her mind. Dr. Lewis wanted Ellie, but Melissa was determined to make herself the target. She sat at her laptop, typing a message to the email address Harris had found in the files. It was risky, but Melissa knew it was her best chance to lure him out. "I know what you want. Meet me at the old bridge tomorrow night, or I'll go to the press with everything." Her finger hovered over the send button. One click, and she would be throwing herself into the lion's den. Taking a deep breath, she pressed send. Part 4. Into the lion's den. The old bridge loomed ahead, shrouded in darkness and framed by the whispering trees of the abandoned park. Melissa stepped out of her car, her breath visible in the cool night air. She clutched the burner phone Detective Harris had given her, its connection to the nearby police team her only safety net. Her heart pounded as she walked toward the agreed meeting spot. She wore a small wire under her jacket, every word she spoke being transmitted to Harris and his team, who waited just out of sight. "Are you sure about this?" Harris had asked her earlier. Melissa's answer had been firm. "If it means keeping Ellie safe, I'll do whatever it takes." The meeting. Melissa didn't have to wait long. A faint rustling broke the silence, and moments later, Dr. Lewis emerged from the shadows, his face partially obscured by the brim of a hat. "Melissa," he said smoothly, his voice calm and disarming. "I knew you'd come around." She forced herself to stay steady, her fists clenched inside her coat pockets. "I want to know why. Why my daughter? Why us?" Dr. Lewis tilted his head, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Ellie is special," he said cryptically. "You should be proud. Not many people get the chance to be part of something so extraordinary." "What are you talking about?" Melissa demanded, her voice trembling with anger. "You wouldn't understand," he replied, his tone almost pitying. "But Ellie, she has potential, something unique in her genetic makeup, and I'm the only one who can help her unlock it." Melissa's stomach churned. "She doesn't need your help. You're sick." Dr. Lewis's smile vanished, his expression hardening. "Sick? Or enlightened? You don't realize what's at stake, Melissa. Ellie's potential could change everything. For her, for you, for the world." The dark intentions. Melissa took a step back, keeping her distance. "You're lying. This isn't about helping Ellie. This is about control." Dr. Lewis shrugged, his demeanor eerily calm. "Call it what you will, but deep down, you know I'm right. Ellie's condition isn't ordinary. Her reactions, her sensitivity, it's the first sign of something greater. I've seen it before, but never quite like this." "What do you mean, seen it before?" Melissa pressed, desperate to keep him talking. "I've been searching for years," he admitted. "Testing, studying. Ellie is the closest I've ever come to finding a subject who fits the profile. She's remarkable, Melissa, and with the right guidance, she could be so much more." Melissa's voice shook with fury. "She's not your experiment." Dr. Lewis's eyes darkened. "She's already part of it, whether you like it or not." The confrontation at that moment, the burner phone buzzed in Melissa's pocket, a signal from Harris. The police were moving in, but Dr. Lewis must have sensed it too. His gaze flickered to the surrounding darkness, and his posture stiffened. "You think you're in control here?" he asked, his voice laced with venom. Melissa stood her ground. "It's over. The police are coming, and they know everything." Dr. Lewis's lips curved into a chilling smile. "Do they?" Before she could react, he reached into his coat and pulled out a syringe. "I didn't want it to end this way," he said, "but I can't let you stop me." The takedown Melissa froze as he stepped closer, the syringe glinting in the moonlight. But before he could act, a sharp command rang out from the darkness. "Drop the weapon. Hands in the air." Red and blue lights flooded the area as Harris and his team emerged, their weapons trained on Dr. Lewis. For a moment, Melissa thought he might surrender. But then he lunged toward her, the syringe aimed at her neck. A deafening crack split the air as a single shot rang out. Dr. Lewis staggered, the syringe slipping from his hand as he collapsed to the ground. The aftermath, Melissa stood trembling as Harris rushed to her side, guiding her away from the scene. Dr. Lewis lay motionless on the ground, his face pale and expressionless. "You're safe now," Harris said, his voice steady. "It's over." But Melissa wasn't so sure. Even as the paramedics arrived and the police began collecting evidence, she couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Lewis's words had been more than the ravings of a madman. A chilling discovery the following day, Harris visited Melissa at her home with an update. "We've started combing through his records," he said. "It's disturbing." "What do you mean?" Melissa asked, her heart sinking. Harris hesitated before continuing. He wasn't lying about Ellie. He had extensive files on her, DNA analyses, genetic markers, neurological data. "It's beyond anything we've ever seen." Melissa's stomach turned. "What does it mean?" "We don't know yet," Harris admitted. "But it's clear he wasn't working alone. Someone funded his research, and whoever they are, they knew exactly what they were looking for." The final twist as Harris left, Melissa sat in stunned silence, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She looked at Ellie, who was sitting at the kitchen table, happily sketching in her notebook, oblivious to the storm swirling around her. For now, they were safe. But the question lingered in Melissa's mind. Who else was out there, watching, waiting? Dr. Lewis may have been stopped, but his obsession with Ellie had only been the beginning. Part 5. The shadows close in the days following Dr. Lewis's death were a blur of police debriefings and cautious relief. Melissa tried to focus on rebuilding some semblance of normalcy for Ellie, but the unease that had settled over their lives refused to dissipate. Detective Harris's warning replayed in her mind. He wasn't working alone. Every time she thought of the detailed files Dr. Lewis had kept on Ellie, a chill ran down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that their ordeal was far from over. A strange encounter. It was a quiet afternoon when Melissa decided to take Ellie to a nearby park to clear their minds. As Ellie played on the swings, Melissa sat on a bench, her eyes scanning the other parkgoers. A man in a dark suit stood near the playground, his presence incongruous with the casual atmosphere. He seemed to be watching Ellie, his gaze lingering too long to be coincidental. Melissa's heart raced as she stood and called out, "Ellie, it's time to go." Ellie frowned but obeyed, running toward her mother. As they walked to the car, Melissa glanced back. The man was gone. The encrypted files that evening, Harris called with an update. "We've decrypted more of Lewis's files," he said, his tone grim. "There's a lot of data on Ellie, far more than we initially thought. He was tracking her since she was 10. Melissa's breath caught. What could he have possibly wanted with her for that long? Harris hesitated. "It's her DNA. According to the files, Ellie has a rare genetic anomaly, something tied to enhanced neural development and cellular repair. It's the kind of thing that could revolutionize medical science or be weaponized." Melissa's knees buckled, and she sank onto the couch. "Weaponized? She's just a kid." "I know," Harris said, "but someone out there sees her as more than that, and we think they might still be looking for her." A dangerous revelation. Melissa's phone buzzed with an unknown number late that night. Against her better judgment, she answered. "You're in over your head, Mrs. Thompson," a voice said, low and cold. "Who is this?" she demanded. "You should have left it alone." Dr. Lewis was doing important work, work that could have saved lives. But now you've disrupted everything. Melissa's pulse raced. What do you want? Ellie, the voice said simply. We'll find her, one way or another. The line went dead. Protecting Ellie, Melissa called Harris immediately, relaying the call. They're making their move, Harris said, his voice taut. We need to get you and Ellie to a safe location. The following day, Melissa and Ellie were relocated to a secure house under police surveillance. But even with officers stationed outside, Melissa couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Her fears were confirmed when she found a note slipped under the front door. You can't hide her forever. Unraveling the network meanwhile, Harris's investigation uncovered a shadowy organization funding Lewis's research. The group, known only as the Ascendants, had ties to private biotech firms, military contractors, and off-the-grid labs. They're obsessed with genetic advancement, Harris explained. Lewis was just one of their operatives. They'll stop at nothing to continue his work. Melissa's hands trembled as she clutched the phone. How do we stop them? We've got a lead on one of their labs, Harris said. If we can raid it and find their central database, we might be able to expose the entire network. A mother's sacrifice that night. Melissa stayed awake, watching Ellie sleep. Her daughter looked so peaceful, so blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around them. Melissa knew that as long as Ellie was hunted, she would never be safe. The Ascendants wouldn't stop, and the police couldn't protect them forever. She made a decision. The next morning, Melissa called Harris. I want to help. Use me as bait. Absolutely not, Harris said. This isn't up for discussion, Melissa replied firmly. They want Ellie, but they'll settle for me if they think I have access to her. Use that to draw them out. The final sting, the plan was set in motion. Melissa would stage a public appearance, pretending to negotiate Ellie's surrender in exchange for their safety. The meeting was arranged at a remote location, with Harris and his team lying in wait. Melissa arrived at the desolate parking lot, her nerves frayed but her resolve unshaken. A black SUV pulled up, and 3 men stepped out, their faces obscured by sunglasses and hats. Where is she? One of them demanded. Safe, Melissa said. You'll never get to her. The men exchanged a glance before advancing toward her. But before they could reach her, Harris's team descended, surrounding them with guns drawn. The men resisted, but the police overwhelmed them, detaining all 3. A temporary victory back at the station, Harris interrogated the men, but they refused to speak. However, the devices confiscated from the SUV contained crucial information about the Ascendant's operations. It's a major breakthrough, Harris told Melissa, but it's not over. There are others out there. Melissa nodded, her exhaustion evident. I just want Ellie to have a normal life. We'll do everything we can to make that happen, Harris promised. A glimmer of hope. Weeks later, Melissa and Ellie returned home under heavy police protection. The threat wasn't gone, but for now they were safe. As Ellie curled up on the couch, watching her favorite show, Melissa sat beside her, pulling her daughter into a protective embrace. We're going to be okay, Mom, Ellie said softly, as if sensing her mother's worry. Melissa kissed the top of her head. I'll make sure of it, she whispered. But as she looked out the window, watching the shadows shift, Melissa knew the battle wasn't just about Ellie's safety. It was about protecting her humanity in a world that saw her as an asset, not a person.